talked about it in advance. John and I do have, I'm Ron Handberg, by the way. John Camp, John Sandford, and I do have several things in common. We both come out of the news business, John out of newspapering and myself out of broadcasting. We both make the Twin Cities our home and have largely written about this area. We write different kinds of books, as those of you who have read one or both. John's protagonist is a cop, and mine are basically reporters. But we hope, what I would like to do, at least, John, we haven't talked about this, is we're going to kind of quiz one another a little bit about some of the nitty-gritty of what we do and how we do it. And but then I think also, somewhere half hour or so into this, that we ought to open it to all of you for any questions you have, because they're probably better than our questions.
Nope.
It might pay, just for those of you who are not familiar, a very brief background on from whence we come. And John, why don't you start in terms of how you got out of newspapering and into this business, for those of you who aren't familiar.
Well, I was in newspaper business for a very long time, starting in the Army. After I was drafted, I was actually sent to Army Journalism School, and that's how I got into it, although I worked for college newspapers. And I came out and I went to work for newspapers. I worked in Missouri, then I worked down at the Miami Herald in Miami, Florida, then came back up here and worked in St. Paul. And so most of that time, I did some time as an editor, and I realized that really wasn't what I could do. It just was not the kind of job for me. And so I spent almost all that time, which amounted to 20-some years on the street. Did a lot of cop stories, a lot of dope. I did some economic stories, but I found that I don't know, I was drawn to the crime stories not because not because they were gory or because I had a sense that I enjoyed that stuff. It was more that you could actually write a clear story. On economics, you can never tell, for example, whether you're right or whether you're wrong. Everybody has an opinion, and everybody's opinion is good. But the crime story, they were almost like the stories that I grew up with. And I come from what seems to be a normal family, but I did have access to Grimm's fairy tales and all those things when I was a kid, so maybe not. But at any rate, I mean, that kind of thing appealed. Now, Ron, you started out, I mean, you were an anchorman, the last job you had in the news business. And so you come from a little bit, you're more of a management type background.
That's true. As a very young man, I tried some short story fiction, not very successfully, but I suppose it planted the seed in my mind somewhere that this is something I'd like to try later on when this career was finished. And I spent 30 years in television news primarily at WCCO here in the Twin Cities. And one other difference between John and myself, I didn't start writing novels until I was 51 or 52, now 58, but I was able to get an early retirement from CCO and sat down to try to fulfill this dream of mine. And we have a cabin up in western Wisconsin, and I simply sat up there for 8 months and pounded out the first draft of what turned out to be Savage Justice. John did a great favor for me. At the time I finished the book, two of us were on a panel together, I think the only other time. And John had been kind enough to read the manuscript for Savage Justice. And at this panel discussion, kind of offhandedly, said it was one of the best first novels he'd ever read. So, of course, once the book was sold, I scurried to him and said, "Would you mind that being a little blurb on the..." And he kindly agreed, and it was very helpful to me in that first book, and to the extent that it's been a success. But we both come out of a business. I'd spent my life writing 10 o'clock newscasts, basically, and the demands there to write concisely and sparsely and without a lot of detail and without a lot of description did not serve me particularly well as I sat down to write the first novel. In fact, my brother, upon reading the novel, said, "Ron, couldn't you throw in a big word here and there?" So it's fairly sparse writing. John, I'd like to know from you, though, like myself, with all the Prey books, I think with the exception of one, I've set them in either Minnesota or Wisconsin. Why have you done that beyond the obvious, though, about knowing the area. And do you think setting really makes a difference in terms of reader appreciation of a book? In other words, can a New Yorker enjoy a book set in the Twin Cities or in Wisconsin as easily as New York?
Actually, I don't think maybe as easy as they can New York, but I think that some people actually kind of go exploring for novels that are in different parts of the country. So when you read like a Tony Hillerman novel, which comes across very much that kind of parched Southwest feel, or and in mine, I've said a couple of them deliberately, said a couple of them in the winter, because I think people associate this part of the country with winter, and that for people who live in California or Florida or any place in the South, the reality of a blizzard is not something that they really know. I mean, like, you can sort of see on national, I mean, when there's a big hurricane, everybody sees it on TV, so you kind of have an idea. It's just air moving with a lot of stuff going through it. We can kind of relate to tornadoes or something up here. But down in the South, they really don't know what a blizzard is, because they can't, it's hard to explain unless you've been in one. And they don't really get the kind of coverage, except after the fact, that things like hurricanes do. So I think that if you've been through that kind of thing, and then you write about it, and you actually, it kind of helps to write about it when it's going on, or at least to think when it's going on, to find yourself thinking that you're going to write about this someday, so that you ought to pay attention to it. And when you do that, you start to notice stuff. And when you notice stuff like that, the people who live here say, well, I noticed that too. It's not something that you ever hear about, but it's something that I noticed also. I'm thinking about the fact that when you go out, like say in Southwest Minnesota, you get what they call ground blizzards out there, which is, there isn't really a snowstorm going on, but the loose snow gets blown by a heavy wind. So you can look up and see a blue sky, and you can't see 15 feet in front of your face. But I mean, you can see airplanes that are 15,000 feet up, and because all the blizzard is taking place. If you know that kind of thing, it adds, I think, a sense of reality to the writing. And even a New Yorker or somebody who lives in Miami or somebody who lives in San Diego can say, that sounds real. It doesn't sound like something that somebody could make up, because it just has the feeling of reality about it. Right now, I'm trying to write a book set in Southern California, and I spent some time there doing a lot of very specific research. And I'm still finding that I'm struggling right now. To make it feel like California. And we'll have to decide in a year or so whether, next May, whether I pulled it off or not. And maybe I won't. But we'll find out.
In one of the earlier panel discussions that I sat in on, it was talked about weather being such an important part of really any book. In the 3 books that I've now written, I've set each one in a different season, because it has allowed me to write differently about the same setting, the Twin Cities, and all 3 of my books are set in the same newsroom, and in the same cities, so I've been limited in terms of the new things you can say about that. But weather is something, especially in Minnesota, obviously, that can lend a whole different flavor to a book. And so, for me at least, it's been very important to be able to write about the starkness of winter and the bitter cold and all the rest, and yet about the beauty of Indian summer and the storms of summer and so forth. So that's been,
or even the beauty of winter. And
absolutely.
That kind of, when I noticed it in your books, you had in Cry of Vengeance, you had a scene set in there's a murder going on, and the murder case is being unraveled by a young reporter. But the whole thing all of a sudden goes on hold when there's a simultaneous school bus accident and a kidnapping. A prominent person's wife is kidnapped and killed. How much of that is based on your actual experience, and how much of it did you make up? I mean, did you actually? I know that you actually see events like that happen, but were you aware of kind of observing them at the time in the chaos of the newsroom?
Those specific things never happened to me at WCCO simultaneously, but situations like that threw the newsroom into absolute chaos, breaking events, have happened to me. I have witnessed it. I've been part of them. And I know what it can do to, as it did in this case, to an ongoing investigation. It throws it all in hold, and all the resources in the newsroom go into trying to cover these kind of breaking stories. in the first two books, many of the experiences, stories cited were based on real events, fictionalized versions of real events that I saw and witnessed and experienced while at WCCO, and some of the anecdotes as well. Two of my favorites. One is that someone comes into the news director and shouts, "We want to cover the birthday party for a 100-year-old lady." And the news director, who's a gruff guy, says, "Only if she's pregnant." That actually happened. Another place where a news director told me at a convention that their newsroom was so bad that the motto of the newsroom had become, "If it's news to us." So you kind of have to experience these events and hear this stuff to be able to. When I first started, and John, I'd be interested in how you face this. When I first sat down to try to write a book, I really hesitated to try to write about television and television news because I thought that was an easy way out. And after about 2 weeks of staring at the computer screen and splitting wood, I decided, well, I better write about television. And I'm very glad that I did. It makes the job obviously much easier. Now, you've chosen a different way, even though you've covered the cops. All of the Prey books deal with Lucas Davenport and are really police oriented, obviously. How have you come to be credible in that area? And the second part of the question, how have you managed to keep Lucas Davenport fresh through 8 Prey books?
Well, I'll take the second question on first. I'm having a little bit of trouble, like thinking about it and keeping him going. It's not so much that I can't come up with the stories. It's that I've been doing it for 8 years, which might be too long. So my next book is not going to have Lucas in it. It's going to have a female main character. And it's going to be set in Southern California. But I still have a contract to do 2 more Lucas books, so there will be more coming along the road. But I just want to kind of break it up a little bit. I mean, it's really hard to keep a guy fresh, over that long a period of time. Some people have done it because I still read like all the John D. McDonald books when they were republished and everything. But even there, the situation is a little bit different. One of the things you want to do, I think, when you're writing a book, particularly a series character, you have to have a situation in which the action is credible. Now, you've chosen a newsroom, and I've chosen a police department, both of which make the fact that these people come embroiled in these things more realistic. It's not real, but it's more realistic. So you wind up with you have a situation like this. For example, I have a hard time with Miss Marple and stories like that because you wonder, this old lady shows up and somebody drops dead and it's a murder. After a while, you'd think everybody would flee as soon as she showed up because somebody's going to drop dead. But I have a hard time making that credible. I have a hard time. People tend to characterize my books as serial killer books, which most of them are not. If you go back and read them, I think maybe they just remember them that way. But I have a hard time because I have to live with it maybe a lot longer than the readers do. I have a hard time having Davenport go back time and time again in these spectacular murders. But at least he's not. I mean, he's in a job where that might require him to work in spectacular murders.
How do you reintroduce Lucas to new readers and not make all the older readers so that?
Yeah, well.
How do you without?
That's a struggle, and what you do, I have a part of a book that I call moving furniture, and that's usually the second chapter where you just move furniture and you try to make it as slick and quick as you can, but that's where you get Lucas back into it for all the people who already know him. So the first chapter of my book is always an action piece in which I really don't bother to introduce Lucas very much. He's just sort of indicated, or maybe he isn't even indicated, maybe it's just something that the bad guy is doing. Then when the second chapter comes along, then that's when I start, because I want people to be into the book, and then I figure if they've read it before, they'll put up with it. If they haven't read it before, then I've got to give them what Lucas is and what he does. So it's sort of more like a technique than anything else.
Have you ever met a Lucas Davenport?
No, never have, because Lucas is too I mean, he's too tough and he's too smart, and he dresses too well, and he's just too neat a guy. And the fact is
Drives fast cars.
he drives fast cars, and I'll tell you another problem that people have, I think, with books, and I sort of wish I had avoided it the way you have, and I guess the way Ed McBain does with the 87th Precinct stuff, is that they have the focus move to different characters, and the problem with, I think that a lot of people like to see people developing romantic relationships. But if you have somebody developing a romantic relationship in book after book after book, pretty soon they seem like a psycho. I mean, the guy falls deeply in love in one book, and then he falls deeply in love in the next book, and then he falls deeply in love in the third book. And I mean, I think people want sincerity, and that sounds crazy. I mean, if the same thing happens in book after book, so then you have to work your way around it. It's a problem, and it's not really a problem. All of this, what we're talking about here, involves the setup of a book. And I think that different people set them up in a different way, and Ron has now got a series going that sort of revolve around a newsroom. A little bit like Ed McBain books, although they're larger books than his. They circle around a newsroom, and I'm beginning to think that that's a pretty smart way to go.
The downside of that, in my books, in each of the books, there's a new main character. But some of the characters from, in the case of now the third book, which I just finished, some of the characters from the first two books carry over into the third, so there is a continuity. In fact, the major character, the protagonist in the second book, is a very important character, albeit not the main character in the third book. The downside is you can't really call that a series, like Lucas Davenport, because it's not the same recurring main character. And I don't know if that's good or bad. There is, I think, an advantage in being a series author as opposed to kind of a setting author, if you will. One area I'd like to get into, John.
Let me ask you something first before we get it. Are any of your characters based strongly on real people? Like, is Don Shelby part of your I mean, is he part of your main character? I mean, even a piece of him, or a little bit? Or any of the other people you met on the
For
set?
those of you out-of-towners, Don Shelby is one of the main anchor people at the station I left. In fact, I hired Don Shelby about 18 years ago. I suppose it's not possible that Don Shelby, or parts of him, his arrogance and other nice things, and I love Don Shelby, are not part of it. Dave Moore, I think, is part of some of the characters. The news director, George Barclay, who is carried now through all three books and is a fairly important part of all three, is based very strongly on my mentor in the business, now gone, now dead, but who's news director at the time I came to CCO, and was very important in my career development, and a lot of George Barclay is based on him. But you can't be too close. Savage Justice, which is the first of the books, deals with a pedophile judge, and the effort by the news department and my hero in particular to expose him before he becomes Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. Well, part of that was based on a real I-team investigation of the station, where they did bring down and expose a pedophile judge who had not been nominated to the Supreme Court, but nonetheless, and also in a Seattle case where another predator judge was exposed by the newspaper in that town as opposed to the television station, and committed suicide in his chambers on the eve of his exposure. But from that, an important part of Savage Justice is a conflict within the station as to whether to expose the judge or not, because he is respected in the community, a good friend of the general manager of the station who fights the exposure. Well, that in fact happened in Seattle at one of the television stations, where they were about to expose this same judge, and upper management prevented it. So you kind of get those ideas, and they come from a variety of different places. I would like to talk about violence for a moment. One difference, I think, between John's books and my own, and I think you would agree with this, John has more explicit violence in his books than I do. And I guess I'd like to know, John, where you draw the line in explicitness, is there such a word, of violence? And the second part of that question, I think also in your books you treat women pretty roughly. And what kind of reaction you have had from women readers to what you do to women?
I haven't had much reaction actually. I mean, people saying that I shouldn't. If that's, I mean, you know, like, I guess the reason that I use violence in my book is because I can't get away from it. If you're on the street, I mean, you just can't get away from it. And the fact that women are victims in my books, in a lot of cases, men are victims in my book. I mean, I think people tend to remember the women victims, but in fact, I think I've had just about as many male victims now as women. But in any case, last week, just a week ago yesterday, I went to speak at a state forensic pathologist convention over in Minneapolis, and it's all the medical examiners, and they had a case. They were showing cases that the people had worked on, and they had one that was set down here in South St. Paul, where a woman was stabbed to death, and they had one that was set up in Canada where a sexual a sexual predator, I guess is the best word for him, killed 3 women. And the fact of the matter is that nothing that's in any of my books approach the viciousness of what actually happens. So I'm sort of stuck. I don't want to make it pleasant. I mean, I've got an old friend down in Miami, who's kind of a famous cop reporter named Edna Buchanan, who does not make things pleasant. And she doesn't make them pleasant in the newspaper because they aren't pleasant. I mean, they're just awful things. And so my editors talked to me in the past about, you know, like, this is a little bit rough. And I'd say, well, it's a little bit rough. I mean, that's sort of the way things are, and I'm reluctant to clean those up because then it sounds too much like entertainment. It sounds too much like entertaining people by making them, but with like, it's too much like drawing a cartoon of it because the violence directed against people, I think if people really knew the kind of violence that we're talking about, that they would be appalled. I mean, they just would not really be satisfied anymore. Put your fingers in your ears if you're really against violence, but the case we saw that they were showing slides on over in Minneapolis was a guy who, after he stabbed these women to death and after he raped them and stabbed them to death, cut them up into pieces and then encased the pieces in concrete and threw them in a lake. And so when they took them out of the lake, and they found that when a fisherman actually found, because the lake started to dry up, found one of these concrete blocks, they cracked open the blocks with the big chisels. They took all the pieces out, and one of the pictures we were looking at was a reassembled woman from I'd say about 30 pieces. And it just put together like a jigsaw puzzle on this thing on the floor. And this is the kind of stuff those people deal with every day, and the kind of stuff that happens a lot. And there's nothing like that in any of my books, but at the same time people say, well, your books are too violent.
Is there a point beyond which you won't go?
Yeah, I
I
don't actually go to reality. I guess that's what I'm saying. Is I don't actually go to the brutality of it. If you have ever seen anybody who's just been in a fight, and I'm talking about a fight that doesn't even make the newspapers, they just go out there and whack on each other in the street. And I mean, they're just a terrible mess, and bones are broken and that kind of thing. But they're not even hurt very bad. And so then you have to say, well, where am I going to draw the line? I am trying to indicate the reality of it without getting too much into it. But by gosh, you know, all I'm really doing, and I swear, is I'm indicating it. I'm not really doing the full, the full impact of it. If I did that, then you start to wonder if you're drifting over into violent pornography. But at the same time, you could defend that as saying this is really what happens. I mean, I think if anybody here reads true crime fiction. If anybody here reads true crime books, that might be actually what some of it is. If they read true crime books, that you'll kind of get a hint, I think, of some of the things that kind of happen.
Let's talk.
Yeah.
Let's talk for a minute about writing habits.
So on the other hand, I don't think I ever castrated him. And we have a man here.
Floating in a bottle. Actually.
Right, and the parts were found floating in the bottle down the Mississippi River, so it was like, that kind of...
That was an exception. Let's talk about writing habits for a second. I'll chime in a minute, but I think a lot of people are interested, everybody varies, but what are your writing habits? When do you like to write? How long do you write?
Now, that was one of the questions I had for you. But I write when I'm doing a book, I write every night, just about every night. And I work 2 or 3 hours, or sometimes 4 hours a night. And I usually work in the night because there's not much going on, and I can't be distracted. I wish I could work early in the morning, but I can't because it seems like, I don't know, there's a lot of light pressure on me or something. But I mean, I just can't. For some reason, I can't get going in the morning, and so I wind up working between about 10 and 2, or 10 and 3 if the pressure's on, and sometimes 10 at midnight if there isn't any pressure. And when I'm really working strong, I usually work every day because the story kind of keeps you going, and you don't. Once you've done this long enough, you can feel the momentum, and you don't want to stop. Now when you write, you've isolated yourself up in your cabin. I don't. I've always written out of my house, but you've isolated yourself up in a cabin up in the Northwoods. So what's all that about?
Well, first of all, I ought to say that John writes a book in the time it takes me to think about one. So he's much faster. I do write. We have a cabin up in western Wisconsin. It's really a year-round place, and it's interesting to me that it's become. I have a place that I could write at home, but because I've written the first now 3 books up there, it's almost impossible for me to leave that as my writing place. It's become a psychological necessity for me to write there. I hope the place never burns down. I am more. I suppose it comes out of this kind of management experience. I'm much more dedicated toward, when I begin writing, to do it almost as a job. I have a very strict routine. I write in the morning until noon, have something to eat, write in the afternoon, get some exercise, write in the afternoon.
I wonder, that word job comes up, and that's the way I think of what I do. It's a job, and it's like a small business, and so you've got to work at it every day. Do other writers think of it the same way, as a job as opposed to as an art form or something?
I didn't early on, but I've now come to that feeling, and in part it's because of this discipline that I've tried to impose on myself. And sometimes there's a variation from that. I don't feel, I suppose because of my age or because I'm not really depending upon writing for a livelihood, I don't feel the same kind of urgency to turn out the books. It's more, in fact, I don't like to write under a strong deadline. But when I do write, I want to do it with some kind of discipline, and I want to get into this too, John, with you in terms of, I write all day, as much as I can write in a day, and then edit the next morning, editing what I've done the day before, and often earlier stuff as well. I suppose, in my case at least, by the time I finish the book, I've read that book 500 times. Because you go back, you're editing all the time. But basically, I edit in the morning what I have done the day before, and then move on to noon. I don't know
But you don't work from an outline or anything.
I do not work from an outline. I think we ought to get into that. One thing, though, that I'm not sure where I heard this. I think it was, I once took a class with Kate Green, which was very helpful to me. And I think it was Hemingway that she quoted as saying that you should never stop writing when you're in trouble. And I've really tried to live by that. If I'm in a place in the book that I'm not sure how I'm going to get out of it, or the words aren't working, whatever, I always try to get through that so that when I start out the next day, I'm excited about where I am. I'm not dreading getting back to the problem. That's really helpful.
I'm not sure if it was Hemingway, but I think it might have been Hemingway who also said that it's good to stop in the middle of something where you're kind of rolling along. Somebody back there says it.
Yes, that's right.
It is, yeah. And so,
that's, I guess, what I was saying.
Yes, it's the same.
Yeah, you sort of get moving, and then the next day when you go into it, you're already sort of in motion, so you can keep it going. That's it.
In terms of, and I know this differs with probably every writer, and it may be just because of the way I began. I don't have an outline. I begin with the basic notion of the plot, and then simply let the story develop. Almost as a reader reads, I try to write. What I found about this, at least in terms of my writing, I think if I had an outline, at least a very strong one, it would close my mind to other possibilities. And what I found, at least in these first 3 books, is that some of the best characters and some of the best twists and development have come out of necessity because of where I was in the book. That there had to be a logical next step, and how could I do that and yet maintain the suspense? And so I have really, in fact, in all 3 of the books, I've not known what my ending would be until I was 3/4 of the way done. And I know that flies in the face of a lot of rules and a lot of the way a lot of people write, but that's what's worked for me. John, how do you?
I usually need to start with a situation, and I'll have to think that up as I go along. And usually, I'll think it up to a year or so before I start the book, so I'll know like what the next Davenport book is going to start with about now. I'll start thinking about that. I'm halfway through another book, but I will sort of have a feeling of what that situation is going to be, and then I can build on that. And then when I get the hardest part of the book is from about, if you're writing books, say just you pick a number out, say like 100,000 words long. The hardest part's going to be from about 30 to 70,000, because then there comes a time when you get toward the end of the book where you kind of launch into an ending sequence, and you can figure out that sequence. At that point, I'll put together usually an outline, but the outline will be just about like this. It'll be maybe about this, and this will be, say, 10 chapters. And I know, it'll be a 1 page or a page and a half in yellow pages, got little boxes and squares. And usually I'll go up to a country kitchen restaurant and have pancakes or something and work out the whole end of the book. Just because, that's comfortable for me, and it sort of keeps me on track. And that's how I think you can write kind of a bang-up ending. You don't get distracted by other things. But basically, I know what you mean. You sort of grow a book sometimes. You're right in the middle of it, and you get a lot of kind of unexpected little offshoots. And the other thing is that one of the things I find is kind of useful about writing about the place where you actually at is that things that happen that strike you as strange, when you're just walking around town, you can put in your books. And there was a situation in one of my books where I was walking around downtown Minneapolis, and I heard somebody playing "You Are My Sunshine" on these big bells, bong, 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 like that. And it just struck me as so weird. And it was obviously coming from the city hall. I went in there, and there's a guy. They've got these little teeny bells. They're about the size of quarters and dimes. And this guy and he programs this thing, and it plays these chimes through loudspeakers. And it just seemed like the oddest thing. So I just have a little scene where these guys are walking down the street, and they say, it's like being on acid. You're walking down the street, and all of a sudden, "You Are My Sunshine" comes kind of banging out of the sky. And it's like, so.
I think necessity also, at least in my case, you come to a point where necessity forces you to develop another character, for instance, in order to keep the book creditable. One of the things I've tried very hard in my books to do, and I know John has as well, is what so often irritated me as a reader was to read books that were unbelievable or depended so heavily on coincidences that you kind of put it down and said that never could have happened, or the chances of that happening were 1 in a million. So I've tried really hard to make what happens in my books believable, that they could actually happen, that people could actually do this. Now you take some liberties, obviously, but it's been real important for me to try to do that, because it was the most irritating thing to me as a reader of this genre.
Well, I don't know. One of the things I tend to go around sometimes and talk about journalism, and last week when I was speaking to the medical examiners I mentioned there's a thing that I call from newsroom is a thing called situational ignorance, in which you have a newspaper reporter who's very bright and who's very bright and everything, but he's thrust into a situation which he simply doesn't know what's going on, and he has to write a news story about it. So he sort of believes the first person he comes to who will talk a good line to him. And sometimes when you're moving a little too fast as a fiction writer, you do the same thing. You sort of do a little bit of research about something, or you remember something. And when I was talking about this last week, some of the medical examiners were telling me that you have a little bit of a problem with specific details in the book. For example, if you set a crime scene and somebody's doing something really strange at the crime scene, and they just won't allow you to do that. I mean, they don't allow reporters to go around and kick around the bodies and lift up sheets to see who's under them. They just don't do that. So when I read a book that involves a newsroom, it really bothers me when things aren't done right, and it bothers me when I read a newspaper story in a novel in which the newspaper story isn't written correctly. I mean, newspaper stories have sort of like a formula or a format in which hard news stories are written. It's called the inverted pyramid, and it's still pretty much followed in a lot of places. And if you read what's a hard news story, it's with that says Lakeville was surprised to be awakened at 3 a.m. last night, by gunfire down by the old Smith house. You know that the guy's never worked for a newspaper because those stories aren't written like that by anyone. So you need to have. There has to be a certain level of credibility in your book, even if you have to bend stuff. There has to be something real about it. One of the reasons that I chose to write about cops is because I could put my guy into a situation that's real. You're writing about newsrooms because you won't make that false step. And it doesn't bother the rest of you when you have something that you know about, and somebody's writing about it. It almost messes up the book. There was a guy, a British writer, and I don't know who. I really don't know who it was at this point. I stopped reading his book, which is sort of marginal anyway, I thought. But this guy was thrown off a boat or fell off a boat or something like that in the Straits, the Florida Straits or something like that, and he floated, and he had a life raft or something, and he floated. And the next day, he knew that he was coming in, that he was just off the coast of Miami because he saw a low range of hills. They had to be the coast. The highest place in Dade County is 12 feet above sea level. There are no hills there. And it made me think, wait a minute, the guy's never been there, because if he had been there, he'd know that there aren't any hills in Miami. There are none. I mean, the highest place, natural place, is 12 feet above sea level. And that bothers you, because you say, okay, everything else from here on must be BS. And I worry about that happening in my books. I'm sure you worry about it happening in your books. And in some ways, that's a constraint, too, because then you have to work.
We're going to open this up in a few minutes, but one thing I would like to know, too.
I've got the secret question I've got to ask you, too.
You talked about writing being a job. Do you still enjoy writing? Is it still a pleasure to you, or has it become...
It's sort of like sex. It's like when you're not doing it, you can sort of get along. When you are doing it, it's sort of like, God, why do I do anything else? It's. But I mean, you can't. So it's like.
He's younger than I am.
Not that much younger. But the fact is that I've got about 900 things going on in my life all the time, and it just sometimes seems like I work like a dog, and when I kind of settle into writing at night, it just feels so good. I mean, this is something that's familiar, and unlike Ron, I like deadlines. And so right now I'm in desperate condition on this book. I'm halfway through it, and I've got to finish it by the end of the month, and I'm not going to make it. I already know that. I mean, it's going to. So I'm going to be writing, 2,500 words a day, trying to make final writing. I'm going to. Everybody at Putnam is going to be mad at me, and I mean, they're already doing publicity on it, and I don't even know how it's going to end. So the job part, I mean, I really do like it. I mean, I have to say that I really do like it. But one of the reasons I work at night, too, is because it is a job. And I need to have a time that's not broken into. Let me ask you the mystery question, and also, where did I put it? This is just an odd thing that came up. Well, see, the thing, it's not a hard question. But the thing is, we sort of knew what we were going to ask each other, but I had this one thing in Cry Vengeance, you have Sarah, the prosecutor, comes in from the craft club meeting, and she leaves her knitting on the floor. And the other woman who lives with her says she noticed that, quote, not a stitch had been cast on. And I wondered where you came up with knitting jargon. I mean, do you knit? Or is it...
The truth is, I had it wrong the first time, and my wife quickly corrected me.
It's a likely story.
We will open this just a second, but John, I got all these questions
because you're dedicated.
Where do you get your plot ideas? I'm going to put about 3 questions together. Where do you get your plot ideas? What is it about writing that you least enjoy? For me, it's the isolation, the actual loneliness that can be a very big part of this whole creative experience of this terrific cabin I talked about. It can also be very lonely, where you are really with the birds and the squirrels, and that's about it. So for me, that's kind of the downside of it. What do you least like about it, and what major lessons have you learned through these now myriad books?
Well, one of the things I learned is that you almost have to learn how to rewrite, learn how to write again every book. And I will say, for people who are writers or who are going to be writers, that there is a very definite learning process that goes on. And you can't really expect to sell your first book. I mean, I didn't. I didn't sell my first several books. The thing is, you've got to learn it. And you will find yourself making discoveries in the middle of the book, and you'll remember that you made the same discovery for the last 4 books. And then you have to go back maybe and redo stuff. So there is like a learning process that goes on, and not only goes on, but repeats itself. I guess the thing that I like least about writing maybe is when I have to throw stuff away. Because I think that on about half of my books I've written maybe, there's a lot of words in books, and it's easy when you're reading it, and there's a lot of craft that goes on that's not visible. One of the things that you try to do is you try to make the words almost invisible, so that the reader is just like in a trance or a dream and actually sees your landscape without seeing the words. So then if you throw in a false word, all of a sudden they come out of the dream and they say, wait a minute, what's going on? And so then you don't want them to do that. So to do this, to get that dream going and keep it flowing, there's a lot of craft involved in that, and you tend to go back over stuff and rework it. And sometimes you find yourself that you've just gone wrong. You've just gone wrong for 10,000 words, and you're off in a corner, and it's not going to work, and you have to throw it away. And making yourself throw it away is very painful. And I do stuff like I've got a little special file up in my computer that says bits and pieces, where I'll rip something out and I'll stick it in bits and pieces because I'm going to want to use it. But because I think it's done pretty well, but I wind up not using it very much because I just have to throw it away because it just doesn't work with the story.
I know the one quote I'm going to leave here with, I'm sure all of you will. John just said that there are lots of words in books.
Lots of words. You said earlier that the experience of writing is sort of like the experience of reading, but you have to remember that for us, the experience of writing is months long. The experience of reading it may be a few hours, so things are much more condensed. And that's is one explanation, by the way, for the mistakes that are made in books. Because what we may be writing, we may have written something in June that doesn't fit with something that we're writing in September, but because we have 4 months between those thoughts, we don't see them even when we're reading through them. But a reader will see it right away. And I think I've had just about one in every book, some of them really embarrassing. And I have a compass setting of 370 degrees, which is a typo in one of my books, and of course there are only 360 degrees in a compass. And not only that, it was on the first page. And that kind of stuff is not good.
If any of you got questions, why don't you kind of walk up to the microphone and sure, go ahead.
Given your mutual backgrounds in the media, how do you feel that the relationship between police personnel and media have changed in the last 10 years? And how has it affected the rest of us or you?
Well, in my books, I've tried to point out what at least was true when I was still in business, and that is a real reluctance on the part of news people to get too close to the cops. Yet it's very difficult, and especially in a fictional setting, you really have to get them closer than in real life they like to be. There's a real hesitation, at least there was during my time, for this hand-in-glove relationship with cops. From what I know, at least, if anything, there's now more layers of bureaucracy that the reporter has to go through to get the information. Both Minneapolis and St. Paul have public information officers that the only people who really talk to you, except your inside sources, and I think those are fewer and fewer today.
Yeah, the thing is, there once cops and reporters tended to come from the same social class, which is sort of like lower middle or something like that, I guess, I don't know. And the thing is working class folks, and reporters were and cops were, and there was like a common background a lot of times, and a lot of times cops or reporters made friends with cops, and they were just, and so they would talk to you, but they would talk to you in a way that later became to be considered not professional. The cop would say, I want to tell you this, don't use it. It's sort of inside information. You can use it when we say okay. And we say, all right. And then we wouldn't use it. And so in a way we were withholding information from the public that maybe we should have been giving them. But that decision sort of was made, it was left up to you. And so there was like this kind of a tight relationship between them. And I like that relationship, frankly. I don't think that most reporters ever, I think that a lot of reporters, I don't know about most because I have no way to judge, but I don't think I ever withheld anything from the public that was necessary for the public to know in any way. And if you like cops, they generally know it. But now it's getting harder to get close to cops because there's the atmosphere is formalized. So you just don't go up and start BSing with cops at crime scenes because they don't want to be seen talking to you because they can get in trouble from the bureaucrats. And the other thing is the bureaucrats become more and more afraid of information getting out of their control. And so they want a formal statement on stuff, no matter how ridiculous it is. They want a formal statement on it. And there has even in the United States arisen a kind of a craft of bullshit in which people will tell you barefaced lies on television that everybody knows are barefaced lies, and then the TV commentators come on and they say, well, that was a barefaced lie. And everybody sort of knows it, but then you have to answer, what's the truth? And I think that a lot of that has to do with the relationship has been bureaucratized. We have actually the Hennepin County medical examiner is sitting back there in a chair trying to hide himself back there. And we had talked about this a little bit last week. Is your relationship with reporters become much more formal, or what is your attitude toward them?
It's Gary Peters.
Yeah, this is Gary Peters, everybody. He's a medical examiner.
Hi, Jonathan. It doesn't seem like Friday unless I'm in a meeting and you're talking.
And I'm talking.
I am speaking tomorrow, so maybe I can look a little at this too. It's a very, very nervous relationship with a reporter. You never know what you're going to say, how it's going to be put into print. I think a lot of times with the perception we have is a reporter says, how can I put a negative spin on what he said? At least that seems to be the goal of a lot of reporters I deal with. A man rescues child from burning building, reporters' approach is, oh, how can I put a negative spin on this so it really becomes a great story? So you become very, very cautious and you phrase things in very careful ways.
If you were just going to judge, and I'm not talking about small insignificant errors, how many times have you talked to reporters, what percentage of the time do you think that you find a significant error in the information that supposedly emanates from your office?
80%.
Yeah.
Also, I think it's very fair to point out that cops and reporters may be two of the most thin-skinned professionals around, or craftsmen around. I think reporters don't take criticism any better than the cops do, and so it can set up a very kind of scratchy relationship.
Yeah.
Well, you had a similar question, but now it's kind of a follow-up. I know that the relationships between reporters and TV people of any ilk can be somewhat adversarial. So I guess I'm assuming that your relationships might have been rather touchy in the past. How is it now that you are not in the news business, but are in the book business? And do you approach them for any kind of checking out of information or leads?
I do, and I'm sure John does, because
Yeah,
he
I do.
writes more about cops than I do, but they are willing, if they know it's fiction, they know you're talking about a novel and not something that's going to be in the newspaper the next day or on television that night, they can be much more open to you. And in my experience, more limited than John's, I'm sure, they have been.
They're not going to lose their job because of something they say to you that winds up in a novel coming out of somebody's mouth who's not.
A year later.
Yeah. And the thing is I go over and have a lunch with the homicide cops over in Minneapolis a couple times a year. I mean, just to kind of keep up with what's going on, and you kind of keep up with department politics and who's doing what to who, and who's getting sued and that kind of stuff, and what the cops' attitude are toward some other cop. And there was a cop who was charged with a couple of internal affairs things over in Minneapolis with police brutality. And some people thought that Lucas was actually based on him, but I saw Lucas long before I'd ever heard of him. And the thing is that when I went over there and I was talking to the cops, I'd say, "What do you really think about this guy?" And they were pretty out front. Some of them would say, "Well, he's a good guy. He's being mistreated." Other people say, "He's a jerk. And he's been looking for trouble for a long time." And they'd say, well, or they'd have some softer attitude or in-between attitude about, he's got an attitude problem, but he's a good cop, and back and forth. And so it becomes more real, I think, and you put a little departmental politics into a book, and people can sort of sense that that's in there too. This is what people really talk about a lot, is about what they do in their lives.
I
Well, I knew a lot of those guys. And I mean, just as a newspaper reporter, as a reporter, I didn't do a lot of daily stories. I tended to do longer stuff. I was a columnist for a while. And I also tended to do a lot of longer stories where I'd actually work with the cops and they got to trust me a little bit. So like one of the last big stories I did for this newspaper here in St. Paul was a long series about cocaine in the suburbs. So I wound up working with their whole drug unit for, I don't know, 6 weeks or 8 weeks or something like that. And along the way, little stories would come up that I just kind of do offhandedly. And they were fine. And so they kind of learn to trust you. And after a while, they know that you're not going to cost them the job the next morning. You're not going to wake up with a big surprise.
Is there another question, or can I?
Yeah.
Go ahead. I thought I saw something.
Yeah, I have a question. We're talking about inconsistencies in your story. I'm working on a story, and the setting is in Rochester, but I'm intentionally putting inconsistencies in there. I'm putting a meat packing plant in there in Rochester. There isn't one, of course. It's in Austin, and I'm placing a mythical town 20 miles west of it that doesn't exist. But I do that so I can. So should I not do that? Because I know if someone looks at that, they're going to say, well, there's no meat packing plant here. I know
No,
that.
you should not do that, but you should know what a meat packing plant's like. And you should know what your mythical town is like. For example, I mean, in Winter Prey, one of my books, I did an entire mythical county and a county seat. I placed them exactly on the county line between two existing counties so that they could talk about this being east and this being west down a highway that actually existed. But there is no dimension. I mean, my county is a line on the map. But you should know what a meatpacking plant's like, so you can give the meatpacking plant some reality. You should know what your small town is like. You should maybe pick out a small town, because every place that's real has idiosyncrasies about it that give it a reality. So you go down and you look at a small town and you find that town's idiosyncrasies, and when you put those in your book, it'll make it come alive. At least that's my feeling about it.
I would differ with that a little bit. I think that something as large as a meat packing plant that is so clearly not in Rochester, I would worry about that a little bit. I wouldn't worry about the mythical town. All of us, I think, take liberties. In this book that I just finished, I mentioned it in one of the panels we were in, I have the characters meeting at a Burger King on Central Avenue Northeast, which really does exist. It's there. I've seen it. But I needed some other characters emerging from a pizza parlor across the street. Well, there is no pizza parlor across the street. I said, screw it, I'm going to make one. But that's, I think, in the area where you can maybe get. I would worry, frankly, about.
Well, I'm also changing streets around too.
That would actually bother me a little bit, because then people can't see. They can't go out and experience what you do if you name. If you had fake streets, that's one thing. But if you had new streets that they could.
Well,
I mean, if you change streets around. I mean,
right.
And I guess the other point is, why do that?
Changing the intersection, basically.
But why do that?
Because the shop that I wanted because.
I know, but what I mean is you could squeeze it between.
Because I could visualize it better when I was writing it. That's why.
Okay. Well, the thing is, you could squeeze it between two existing streets. A real story is that I wrote a story that said somebody walked out of the Star Tribune building and looked down the street. The copy editor in New York called me up and said, if you walk down that street, you can't see that. And I said, of course you can. I mean, I live here. And she said, no, you can't, because I called there. So I went down and looked, and sure enough, you can't find it. I mean, you can't see it from there. I thought that you could see the Metrodome from someplace at the Star Tribune building, but you can't. It was something like that. And another time she called up and said that it's not a red brick building at the University of Minnesota. And I said, yes, it is. And she said, it's an orange brick building. And I said, I'm sorry, there are two colors of bricks, red and white, and it's a red brick building. But the thing is that I think that if you invent a street, then people aren't bothered by it. If you have a real street in Rochester, and they're standing on the street looking down at it, you said they look right past the Burger King at the such and such building, and they'd say, boy, you can stand out there and you look right past the Burger King, and the City Hall is there, then you've got more of a problem. Because now things, it's not that they're invented, it's they're wrong. You see what I mean?
Talking just about editing before we get to the next question. One of the questions I was going to ask you about your relationship with your editor. Have you had the same editor? Have you had a series of editors? How has his or her relationship with you changed with the succession of books?
Well, one of the things is that I have had one editor. His name is Neil Nyron. He also edits Tom Clancy and Robert Parker and by the way, before I answer the rest of that question, I will tell you a blurb story. Robert Parker gave me a blurb for my first book. It said, "Grabs you by the throat and never lets go." About a year later, I met Robert Parker. We had no idea of what the book was or who it was. So I think somebody at Putnam cashed their chips with him, for my book, which I'll always appreciate it. But I mean, I was a complete mystery to Parker. That's like
You didn't issue a correction on that, or?
no. Matter of fact, they'll still fight in my books. I think it's like it's just that I'm not sure anymore that the book didn't let go. But anyway,
Is he as
early.
demanding? Is he as how has his relationship with you changed?
You mean the editor?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You were.
One of the things about editing, I think now, and I don't know how your relationship goes, but at Putnam, with my editors, they expect the manuscript to be in really excellent shape when it arrives. I mean, they are dealing with me as a professional writer, not as with an artist. I'm more like a craftsman than I am like an artist. They do not expect anything weird to come in the door. They want it to be in good shape. They want it to be a professional manuscript. They want it basically to be computer generated and numbers at the top corners of the pages. They want the manuscript to be in good condition, and because it's a professional job. It's like it's just like you'd expect a lawyer to do something, or you'd expect a surveyor to do something, or whoever is doing work for you. You expect it to be engineered in the proper form, so that when my manuscripts get there, he may have a big problem with it, but he usually won't have a small problem with it. And so I send him a half of my manuscript last week or a week ago, and he said everything is fine, it's great, it's going to work wonderfully, except there's just one problem. And I'm like, oh no. And he said, the main male character can't be a professional golfer. Well, I've only got the main male character in approximately 78 scenes, which refer to him as being a professional golfer, all of which had to be redone. And then he presents a very cogent argument to me why this can't work, and he's absolutely right. And this is why I talk about tearing up the book. I'm going, oh no, I'm going to have to tear it up. And I'm just starting to tear it up now. And he just can't be. And now I'm starting to talk myself into the fact that maybe I can save it by making him a really enthusiastic amateur golfer. Make him a lawyer who really likes to play golf, because I got this great scene written at a golf driving range and I can't figure out how to change it. So if you get the book next year, you may find that the guy is now a really enthusiastic
It
amateur.
goes to bits and pieces, I think.
Yeah, but my feeling about that is that my editor tells me about the big stuff, but he expects me as a professional to take care of the small stuff. Is that what
It has been mine, although with far fewer books. But what's been amazing to me, John, having grown up in the newspaper business, has had editors and has worked with editors in the newspaper business. Growing up in television, I never really had an editor. In fact, I was the editor. So this experience working with an editor was really all new to me, and it's been wonderful. I've learned so much in the first two books, which I think obviously translated, I hope, into the third book. The third book is much tighter, much cleaner than were the first two. So it's been a great experience for me, and the editors have been helpful. And usually, I agree with John, they're right. Even though they're telling you to cut something or doing something that you don't really want to do, when the end comes, they're right.
I'll tell you a couple more things about editors. One of them is they have no idea of how we do what we do. They're very good readers, but they have no idea of how this goes on. All they know is that we're sort of their meal ticket in a way, and they really want us to do it really badly, but they don't know how we do it. I mean, they've been around a lot of writers and they've talked to them and everything like that, but they don't know it in the way that we maybe look at a cop and really don't know what a cop's job is like if you're not one. And so they're always very nervous about it. And one of the things you find out if you go to New York, or at least I thought this, if you go to New York, even if you have an editor with a good sense of humor, at first they won't laugh at your jokes because they're not sure that you're not serious, especially if you tend to irony. So you say the most outrageous things, and they'll just sit there with these straight faces like, oh my God, he's just about to flip out. They think you're nuts, and you wind up wait a minute, that was a joke. And then phew, that's good.
It can get to the ridiculous point, however. With Savage Justice, the first book, which was in very rough shape, I assume, and I suppose it went through a dozen revisions with the editor. It finally came down to the final revision. She wanted literally one sentence taken out of page 231 or something. I thought, Jesus, are people going to stop reading this book because of this one goddamn sentence? But I took it out.
But I'll tell you, the thing about editors is that most people, I think, think of editors as gadflies or something, but you literally can't get along without it. When I wrote a Pulitzer series about 11 years ago now, and I got the Pulitzer, but it was like really the editors who just, and I mean, it's true in newspaper works as it is in books, the editors are just absolutely essential to it. When I would go out and I'd be working on something really difficult as a newspaper reporter, I wanted a good editor supporting me. I mean, you just had to have it, because it's somebody who kind of keeps you in touch with real life and sort of keeps you in touch with what's going on. And also, they're such expert readers that they can tell you when you've really gone off the track. And I mean, they're just absolutely essential. You cannot get along without them. I mean, you just feel naked if you're out there without one. So.
You had a question?
Yeah, just two areas real quick. One, both of you work really intensely in terms of law enforcement and media, and I think especially in the early novels, the relationship with the media was a fairly significant issue, and still is in later novels. What kind of feedback do you get from law enforcement and from media people that you know regarding how realistic or non-realistic the relationship or the characters are? And I guess secondly, John, for you, you mentioned the 87th Precinct, and it seemed to me your latest novel tried to be much more a viewpoint of Davenport's team than just Davenport. It looked like there was much more of a personal life and the development of the other characters. Is that intentional? Do you plan to develop that?
Probably not, but I mean, I do like. I think that maybe I'll come back to focus a little bit more on Davenport. But the fact is I'm not trying to do what Ed McBain does with 87 Precincts, but that's one of my favorite series of books. I mean, I think I read all of them. And I mean, one of the reasons I write what I do is because I was a pretty big fan before I started writing this kind of stuff. And I guess if you had asked me what I was going to be when I was 18, I wanted to be Hemingway, but by the time I was 35, I wanted to be Ross Thomas. And maybe I'm going downhill, and maybe not, because I mean, I really liked Ross Thomas a lot, and I was really sad when he died. But basically, the cops like my books a lot, most of them, and I have a lot of police officers come to my signings over Minneapolis and get books and offer to help me. I've got a card file of business cards and stuff at home of people I can just call up and ask questions of. Like what's going on? I mean, like I've got a crime scene now. What's happening here? And that's where, in a lot of my books, stupid things happen to cops. I mean, stuff that something gets totally screwed up, and that's comes from talking to cops. They'll say, "Man, something so stupid happened the other day," and you also find a lot of little